Hello, hi. Hey, I have already have a YouTube movie posted on week 3, but I'm actually going to be putting this YouTube movie first, and I will have emailed you about that. Um, if you look at week 3, I'm looking. By the way, the reason I keep looking over here this way is I'm looking at either the syllabus or the the textbook itself. But if you look at week 3, we're getting into these designs in more depth that we talked about a little bit before, and that is the survey design, correlational design, and causal comparative design. Now, I have to tell you to start off with, there is some question as to whether there is such a design called correlational. It's a non-experimental design, just like survey research. Now, the questions that I ask you to look at on discussion board for the survey design, I say, what would you be most careful about if you use the survey design? And if you look through the textbook, you'll see that it talks about, I'm looking specifically at figure 7.1 on page 187. It looks at a sample questionnaire, and it shows some demographic information. Uh, it has a checklist, a Likert scale, and a free response. The purpose of that particular figure is to show you different kinds of questions that could be asked on a questionnaire. Speaking of a questionnaire, one of the confusions that students often have is between a survey design and the instrument that's used typically in a survey design. The instrument is called a questionnaire. The design is called a survey design. In addition, if you look at table 7.1 on page 189, it talks about guidelines for constructing a questionnaire, and it gives you some very helpful hints on what makes for a good questionnaire and what does not. Talks about pilot testing, and then if you look at the cover letter, it's on figure 7.2 on page 190. Administering the questionnaire. And then when you get into, on page 193, it starts talking about non-response and actually tabulating questionnaire responses, etc. And then finally on page 194, there's a box on digital research tools for the 21st century. So these are some of the important elements from that chapter. And so the question is, what would you be most careful about if you selected a survey design? So think about some of the things that I mentioned and some of the things that you think might be especially important in terms of conducting a survey design. Okay, then moving on to Chapter 8 on correlational research or correlation design. The question that I ask you is, what did you find most difficult about correlation designs? Now, only each of you can answer that question, but I would like you to focus in on the data on page 206 in table 8.1 that has variables, IQ, GPA, and IQ and weight, and IQ and errors. And then try to look at the relationship between those two variables in each of those columns. For example, under IQ and GPA, it has an R, or correlation coefficient, of plus 0.95, which is extremely high. And then you have a plus 0.13, which is low, or no relationship, as they say, and negative 0.89, which is extremely strong, but in a negative way. That is, as IQ goes up, the number of errors on a test go down, and it makes sense. So the strength of the correlation coefficient is the number. The plus or minus sign is the direction in which it goes. In addition, if you look at page 207 on figure 8.1 on page 207, you'll see a graphic, or what's called a scattergram, of that same data. So look at table 8.1 and table and figure 8.1 together. It could be very useful. Your book then goes on to talk about statistical significance. Now, this might be an area where there is some confusion, so I invite questions there. Data analysis and interpretation on page 210. It talks about how to make sense of the coefficient, but then table 8.2 then shows that although we mostly talk about the Pearson product movement correlation coefficient, where both variables are interval variables, meaning that the numbers are equal distance between the numbers, there's other things that we can measure with correlation coefficient. And table 8.2 will show you the different types of variables, variable 1 and variable 2, that we can measure using different types of correlation coefficients. Your book then goes on to talk about prediction studies on page 212. That actually gets into what's called regression analysis. There's a lot of statistical techniques that are based on correlation. Prediction studies means, for example, if we have a set of IQ scores, or let's say SAT scores, then colleges hope to be able to predict how well students may or may not do in college, okay, in particular colleges. And you might want to read that on prediction studies. It goes on, for example, on page 213, there's a little equation there under data analysis. It says y is equal to a plus bx. Some of you may remember that as a little equation for a straight line, and that's in fact what we try to do with prediction studies. It then gets into some little bit more esoteric stuff, and it might be helpful for you to at least read this other correlations-based analyses beginning on page 214. Discriminant function analysis, etc. Believe me, that's complicated for me, and I have not studied that in a long time. But if anybody has any questions about that, I would be happy to talk to you about that. Okay, so then finally, chapter 9, it says, give an example how you might use a causal comparative design. Causal comparative designs are basically ones where the independent variable has already taken place. They may use the example here, or I may use it, where it would be unethical to say to a group of students, okay, you have, to the parents, you half are allowed to send your kids to preschool, and you other half, you're not allowed. And obviously we can't do that and don't want to do that. But what we can do is at a later point in time, say 5th grade, we can randomly select a group of kids who did attend preschool and a group of kids who did not attend preschool, and then look at their grades in 5th grade. We can then make an inference that perhaps going to preschool or not may have had an impact on 5th grade achievement. By the way, that was our dog, our beagle Snoopy, you just heard howling. Okay. So if you look through this chapter, if you look at page 228, I'm sorry, it begins actually on page 227. It has a summary of the causal comparative research, which is very helpful. The definition and purposes on page 228. And notice figure 9.1 on page 230. It talks about variables that oftentimes can only be investigated using a causal comparative design. Probably the simplest example is this. If you're interested in looking at the impact of age, that says organismic variables, it's easy for me to say, age, sex, ethnicity. One usually does not change one's age, sex, or ethnicity. So you can't randomly assign somebody, you know, you're now going to be 30 years old. So what we have to do is we have to take the variables as they exist instead of manipulate them, as we will see you do in experimental studies. It talks about control procedures on page 232, including matching, comparing homogeneous groups or subgroups, because you see, because we do not randomly assign participants to treatments as we do in experimental studies, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, we need to try to control for the effect of other variables. And if you look at the control procedures, one of the techniques is matching, where we match students perhaps on IQ, and they then look at the impact of some particular independent variable. So read that over and see if you have any questions about that. It also talks in the last section, it talks about on page 233 about this analysis of covariance. Analysis of covariance is in fact a unique process. It's actually a statistical procedure where we statistically control for the effect of some variable rather than by design, by randomly selecting students. What we'll do is for a control procedure, we may use, for example, IQ as a covariate, meaning if we look at the impact of preschool on 5th grade achievement, we may then control for IQ by using IQ as a covariate. This is a complicated procedure. I don't expect you to understand everything about it, but read that over, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer those. Okay, so for week 3, what you're supposed to be doing in addition to those chapters is also posting your entire report to electronic assignments for grade. I think you have all submitted your complete project in draft form, or most of the pieces, and I've given you some feedback. And now your task is to look at that feedback, to do a final review yourself, and then to post the completed assignment for grade. As usual, if you have any questions, please post them to discussion board or email me, and I'll be glad to answer those. Okay, I think that's the end of this 11, almost 12-minute YouTube. Thanks again for attending the class, and I'll talk to you later.